When people talk about climate change, the discussion often comes down to the issue of consensus. If climate change is a scientific problem, what are the scientists saying about it? Media personalities can give widely differing answers to this question.
On this side of the debate, every scientist in the world. On the other, Mr. Potato Head.
Hello and welcome to Global Warming. The debate continues. I'm David Asman. Today, almost all scientists agree there is global warming, but there's no scientific consensus about what causes global warming or how it will affect our lives.
The problem is that there is more than one definition of the word consensus. On the one hand, it can imply unanimity. Either everyone involved agrees, or a consensus doesn't exist. On the other hand, it could just imply agreement among the majority of people involved. For complex scientific questions, all we can normally expect is agreement of an overwhelming majority. The famous philosopher Karl Popper once said that scientific theories are forever tentative. That is, you never know whether they might turn out to be wrong in some way. If there's always room for doubt, it follows that there will always be a few doubters, no matter how well supported a scientific theory is. Scientists have an old saying that paraphrases something the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Max Planck once said. It goes, "Old theories never die, their adherents do." So how does science ever move on if there is always room for doubt? The answer is consensus. Prominent science historian Naomi Oreskes addressed this issue in a recent talk.
History shows us clearly that science does not provide certainty. It does not provide proof. What it provides us with is the consensus of experts based on the organized accumulation and scrutiny of evidence.
If scientific questions are settled by the consensus of expert opinion based on the evaluation of evidence, what kind of consensus is there about whether humans are causing significant climate change? Actually, there have been two recent studies done to determine the extent to which a consensus exists among scientists about whether humans are causing significant climate change. The first, by Peter Doran and Maggie Kendall Zimmerman at the University of Illinois, was published in 2009 in EOS magazine, which is a publication of the American Geophysical Union. They did a survey of Earth scientists and asked them this question: do you think that human activity is a significant contributing factor in changing mean global temperatures? 82% of the respondents answered yes, but it got more interesting when the respondents were separated out by discipline. Of those who were climate specialists and who had written about climate change in more than 50% of their recent peer-reviewed publications, 97.4% answered yes. In other words, the more expertise people have about the issue, the more likely they are to think that humans are significantly contributing to changing the climate. The second study was done by William Anderegg and his associates at Stanford University and the University of Toronto. It was published in 2010 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They first compiled a list of scientists who had been on the author lists of prominent climate change reports or had signed public statements saying they were convinced or unconvinced by the evidence for human-induced climate change. They then ranked these scientists in terms of how many peer-reviewed papers they had published about climate and how many times these papers had been cited by others. 98% of the top 50 climate researchers, 97% of the top 100, and 97.5% of the top 200 were convinced that humans are a significant cause of climate change. These studies show that there is an overwhelming consensus among climate researchers, but they also show that it's possible for an expert in the field to disagree. If experts can disagree, how are the rest of us supposed to decide whom to believe?
Ladies and gentlemen, the very best thing about science catfights is that we laymen don't understand either side's argument. So we can just pick the one that confirms our beliefs.
Lay people really only have three choices if we want to form a definite opinion about the causes of climate change. First, we can become experts in climate science ourselves, so we can be informed well enough to judge between different expert opinions. This would be ideal, but it isn't feasible for most people. It takes years of training and experience to become an expert in a technical field, and climate science involves several overlapping disciplines. Second, we can simply accept the judgment of the vast majority of climate scientists. This is the kind of thing we normally do when we have questions about the advice of a doctor, a mechanic, a contractor, or any other kind of specialist. We will usually ask more than one and see what most of them are saying. Third, we can reject the judgment of the vast majority of climate scientists and throw in our lot with a tiny minority. As we have seen, there is always some room for doubt, so this isn't necessarily the wrong choice. If we follow this third option, however, it isn't easy to convince others to follow suit. After all, most people wouldn't be very impressed by a TV commercial that says 1 out of 33 dentists recommend chewing sugarless gum. What's more, most people wouldn't even want to admit to themselves that they're putting their trust in only 1 out of 33 experts. Therefore, people who put their trust in this tiny minority of climate scientists have come up with a couple ways to convince themselves and others they are making a rational choice. First, people try to convince themselves that there isn't such a strong consensus of experts about climate change by diluting the pool of experts. A good example of this tactic is a petition circulated by the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine, a small nonprofit organization that, among other things, markets a homeschooling curriculum for parents who are worried about socialism in education, and a book called Nuclear War Survival Skills. The petition asked people with scientific training to sign a statement declaring, "There is no convincing scientific evidence that human release of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing or will in the foreseeable future cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of the Earth's climate. Moreover, there is substantial scientific evidence that increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide produce many beneficial effects upon the natural plant and animal environments of the Earth." The organizers of the petition project proclaim that 31,487 American scientists have signed the petition, including 9,029 with PhDs. But wait a minute. Usually one has to have earned a PhD to be employed doing cutting-edge scientific research, but only 29% of the signers have earned one. Especially those with only bachelor's degrees often end up working outside of the field or as lab technicians, and it turns out that 40% of the signers only have bachelor's degrees. Just who did the organizers count as scientists competent to assess the state of climate science? The answer seems to be anyone with any kind of scientific training whatsoever. 8% of the signers are medical doctors or veterinarians, for example. Fully 48% of them obtain their degrees in nuclear engineering, mechanical engineering, aerospace engineering, chemical engineering, electrical engineering, some undisclosed kind of engineering, or metallurgy. Now, it's certainly true that any scientific training would put you ahead of the general population if you want to try to get up to speed on climate science. But if someone with scientific training doesn't have degrees in the relevant fields, it is still very unlikely that they have actually gone to all the work it would take. After all, if you have a question about climate science, would you really go ask a metallurgist, electrical engineer, veterinarian, or technician in a local urine and blood sample lab? Just how many of the signers of the Oregon petition have degrees with the relevant specialties? That's hard to say, even though most entomologists, people who study insects, don't study anything to do with climate change. A few might study how climate change affects insect populations. And even though most geochemists don't study climate change, a few do use geochemical indicators to study past climate. Of all the disciplines listed, we can only be sure that those who obtain degrees in atmospheric science, climatology, and meteorology had any training directly related to climate science, and these only represent 1.6% of the signers. Also, remember that less than a third of the signers have PhDs, so it is virtually certain that less than 1% of the signers have PhDs in these fields. So while it might initially sound impressive that 31,487 American scientists don't believe there is any convincing scientific evidence that human greenhouse gas emissions will be a big problem, when we investigate the claim further, it turns out that it didn't take much specific expertise to be admitted into that club.